They told Keanu Reeves to leave, hoping he'd get angry. His response left the entire restaurant silent. Before we continue the story, tell us in the comment below, where are you watching from? And if you like these kinds of stories, make sure to subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow at 7 p.m. we have an amazing fresh story lined up for you. Keanu Reeves parked his truck in front of Café San Miguel, a modest restaurant in the heart of a small Salvadoran town. It was the kind of place that had been serving homemade food for decades, with a flickering neon sign and the aroma of freshly made pupusas and strong coffee escaping through the door whenever someone came or went. Someone had mentioned the place to him earlier that day. A local assured him they served the best breakfasts and that the owner still prepared the food with his own hands. Someone had mentioned the place to him earlier that day. A local assured him they served the best breakfasts and that the owner still prepared the food with his own hands. Reeves was exhausted. It had been a long day filled with meetings, greetings, and conversations about his latest movie. All he wanted was a quiet meal before continuing on his journey. The bell above the door jingled as he entered. The place was small but welcoming, or at least it seemed so at first glance. It was the type of restaurant where the same customers occupied the same tables every night, where a wall full of faded photographs displayed decades of diners and employees. The air was filled with the scent of freshly made tortillas and café de olla, while the murmur of conversations filled the atmosphere. Reeves looked at the young woman behind the counter. She was about to smile until she recognized him. It was fleeting, but he noticed a flash of uncertainty on her face, as if suddenly she didn't know what to do. Her lips pressed into a thin line. He glanced around. Some customers had turned their heads in his direction. A man mid-bite leaned in and whispered something to the person opposite him. Another, a woman in a plaid shirt, placed her coffee cup on the table with a louder thud than usual, her eyes narrowing slightly before she looked away. Reeves wasn't naive. He'd been in enough places to recognize when he wasn't entirely welcome, but here, in a simple cafe. The young woman behind the counter hesitated before stepping forward, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Good evening," she said cautiously. "Will you eat here or to go?" Reeves released a weary, slight laugh. "I'll eat here, if that's not a problem." Another silence, too long for such a simple question. She glanced over her shoulder toward the kitchen, then back at him. "I need to check something quickly. One moment, please." She disappeared behind the swinging door. Reeves stood there around him. Some people murmured. A man seated at the counter shifted in his seat. Someone muttered under their breath. Something wasn't right. Seconds dragged on. From the kitchen, voices rose and fell, too muffled to distinguish clearly. Reeves exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back. He wasn't going to make a scene, nor jump to conclusions. Perhaps it was just a policy or short staffing tonight. The young woman returned. This time she didn't seem hesitant, she seemed resolved. "I'm sorry, sir," she said more firmly. "We can't serve you tonight." But the way she said it, the way the air in the room tightened around her words, made it clear this wasn't a business matter. It was personal. For a brief moment, Keanu Reeves said nothing. Her words hung heavily between them, a statement that required no explanation. The restaurant grew quiet, not completely, but enough. In the kitchen, the grill still sizzled. Somewhere, a fork scraped a plate, but the usual murmur had faded. People watched, waiting. Reeves studied the young woman's face. There was no hostility, just determination, as if the decision had already been made, or perhaps someone else had made it for her. His eyes shifted toward the kitchen window behind the counter. Two cooks watched the scene from the shadows, their faces unreadable. He cleared his throat. "Excuse me, have I done something wrong?" This time she didn't hesitate. "It's just that we'd prefer not to serve you tonight. It's not restaurant policy, it's not because we're about to close. It's simply that." Reeves dropped his hands onto his hips, exhaling through his nose. He had been in uncomfortable situations before, heated artistic films debates, tricky interviews designed to trip him up. But this was different. Being rejected in a roadside cafe carried a different weight. A throat cleared, breaking the silence. Reeves turned slightly and caught the gaze of an older man seated at the counter, seemingly a long-time customer. His worn blue work jacket and weathered hands told stories of years of labor. He shook his head, more to himself than anyone else, before spearing the last remnants of his breakfast. A few seats away, a woman shifted uncomfortably, her expression unreadable. Across from her, a younger man, perhaps in his 30s, leaned back with crossed arms, as if enjoying the spectacle. Reeves noticed everything, the glances quickly averted, and those lingering longer than necessary, with something sharp in them, something closer to satisfaction. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had options. He could simply leave, shake his head, and let it go. He could demand an explanation, remind them how this would look in tomorrow's headlines. He could openly challenge them, see if they'd stand firm once they realized they were refusing service to a public figure. But he didn't. "All right," he said, calmly, nodding slowly. "Can I speak with the owner?" Some people looked surprised. The young woman hesitated again, glancing quickly toward the kitchen as if seeking permission. Silently, the older man at the counter muttered something. Someone near the window chuckled briefly, as if unable to believe Reeves was actually doing this. He simply stood, waiting. The young woman disappeared again, this time through a different door. The silence thickened. Only the occasional slurp of coffee or a plate sliding across the counter could be heard. Then the door swung open abruptly. A man in his 50s emerged, sturdy with thick arms and a grease-stained apron across his chest. His name tag read, Don. He didn't ask what Reeves wanted. He just looked him up and down and spoke bluntly. "They told me you have a question." But his tone was neither welcoming nor polite. It was a challenge. Reeves met Don's gaze serenely, revealing nothing. He wasn't there to argue or show power, but he wasn't leaving without understanding why he was being treated this way. "Yes," Reeves replied calmly. "I want to know why you won't serve me." Don exhaled sharply through his nose, as if he'd expected the question, but still had no desire to answer. He wiped his hands on his apron, glancing quickly at customers still attentively watching the scene. Some pretended not to listen, others didn't even try to hide their curiosity. "Look," Don said, shifting his posture. "It's not personal." Reeves raised an eyebrow. "It sounds pretty personal." Don's jaw tightened. He rubbed the back of his neck and finally let out a sigh. "People here have opinions about you, about what you represent. I have a business to run, and I don't want trouble." Reeves nodded slowly, letting the words settle. "And me sitting down to eat is trouble." Don didn't respond immediately. His gaze slid toward the bar, where the older man in the blue jacket had returned to his plate, chewing more slowly now. A few seats away, the younger man still had his arms crossed, watching the scene with a satisfied smile, as if this was the best entertainment of the night. Reeves had seen this before, not exactly this scenario, but enough to recognize the pattern. It wasn't just about a decision, it was about what it meant, how it would look, how people would react. It was about the domino effect, the pressure from all sides, the silent expectations that could push someone into decisions they weren't even sure they agreed with. He looked back at Don. "Be honest with me," Reeves said firmly yet calmly. "Do you really agree with this, or are you just trying to keep the peace?" Don hesitated. His fingers tightened slightly on his apron, and for the first time, Reeves saw something that looked like discomfort, as if perhaps Don wasn't as certain about this as he pretended to be. But before he could respond, the younger man in the back seat burst out laughing. "Come on," he said mockingly, shaking his head. "It's not that deep. You're just not welcome here. Simple as that." Reeves turned and observed him for a moment. He seemed like the type who enjoyed a good fight, someone who'd been waiting for a chance to speak up. But Reeves didn't take the bait. Instead, he looked back at Don. I don't have a problem leaving, Reeves said serenely, if that's really what you want. The words hung in the air, giving Don a chance to breathe, reconsider, resist the pressure that had brought them here. Don glanced toward the kitchen, then back at Reeves. I don't want this to get ugly, he finally said. Reeves nodded slowly. Neither do I. For a long moment, neither spoke. Reeves could have left, shaking his head, walking out the door and never looking back. He could have made a call, turned this into headlines, let the internet do what it did best. But instead, he did something no one expected. He pulled out a chair, sat down and said, "Then let's talk." The air in the cafe shifted. The tension thickened. Reeves didn't throw the chair, didn't puff up his chest or raise his voice. He simply sat, resting his hands on the table as if he had all the time in the world. The restaurant wasn't accustomed to this. Confrontations usually ended quickly, with someone storming out or shutting down entirely. But this wasn't the same. Don stared at him for a long time before slowly exhaling. "Talk?" he repeated, as if the word made no sense in this context. Reeves shrugged. "You don't want me here, I get it. What I don't understand is why, so let's talk about that." From the back seat, the younger man laughed again. "This guy has guts." Reeves ignored him. Don pulled the chair in front of Reeves, but didn't sit, leaning against its back with arms crossed. His apron still had traces of flour from the morning. "I run a business," he finally said. "I'm not looking for trouble. I don't want headlines, but I have a community to think about." Reeves nodded. "Fair enough. Then tell me what this community thinks about me." Don looked over his shoulder, as if expecting someone else to answer for him. The waitress behind the counter shifted uncomfortably. The older man in the blue jacket kept his eyes down, though his fork hadn't moved in a while. Then Don turned back to Reeves. "People here don't like actors. They don't trust them. And some of the things you've said, some turn in movies you stand for. They just don't sit right." Reeves leaned slightly back in his chair. "That sounds fair, but tell me something. You don't know me, do you?" Don hesitated. "Not personally, no." "Then tell me," Reeves continued. "If I were just an ordinary man walking through that door, someone you'd never seen on TV, would we be having this conversation?" Silence. Reeves let it stretch out, watching Don's expression subtly shift. It wasn't a complete change, but something had cracked, even if slightly. From the back, the younger man's voice interrupted. "This isn't about TV, man. It's about people knowing who you really are," he said arrogantly, as if finally getting the attention he'd sought. Reeves turned to him. "Oh yeah? And who am I?" The younger man leaned forward, enjoying the moment. "You're the guy who says he understands regular people and help them, but in the end, you're playing that for your benefit like everyone else." Reeves nodded slowly, considering his words. "All right," he said calmly. "Then tell me, what do you think I should have done differently?" The younger man blinked, caught off guard. It wasn't the response he'd expected. "You want me to leave?" Reeves continued. "That's fine, but you have the floor. Say whatever you need to say." The restaurant fell completely silent. Even the kitchen had stopped. No clashing dishes, no orders being taken, only anticipation. Don sighed, running a hand over his neck. "This isn't what I expected tonight." Reeves gave a faint, tired smile. "Me neither." For the first time, the tension didn't feel like an irreparable divide. It felt like something closer, to an attempt to understand each other. Now, everyone was paying attention. Even those pretending not to care were peeking discreetly over their plates. Reeves waited patiently. The younger man, still leaning back, seemed to want to speak, but for the first time, doubt crossed his face. Perhaps realizing Reeves wasn't arguing, wasn't defending himself, just waiting. Don, still gripping the chair, finally let out a sigh. "You want to know what people think?" He shook his head. "They think you're a fake." Reeves didn't react immediately, just tilted his head slightly as if considering the words. They think you talk about poor and homeless people, but keep playing the same old game, making promises like any suit-wearing actors. But when the moment comes, nothing changes. Don exhaled sharply. And people don't forget. Reeves nodded slowly. I understand. The younger man gave a sarcastic laugh. That's it? Reeves turned toward him. What else do you want me to say? The younger man straightened. I don't know, man. You're supposed to argue, defend yourself, say something. Reeves leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, fixing his gaze steadily. You'd already made up your mind about me. Before I walked through that door, you wanted me to get angry, Reeves said calmly. You wanted me to fight, so you'd feel justified. The young man opened his mouth but said nothing. Reeves continued serenely. But tell me something, what if I told you I know exactly how it feels, that frustration? He turned to Don. You said nothing changes. I know that feeling. I grew up with it. I saw people around me being left behind. I felt it myself. And yes, I studied, did things no one expected, but that doesn't mean I've forgotten. Don's fingers tapped against the chair, his expression unreadable, but no longer entirely skeptical. Reeves scanned the cafe. You don't have to agree with me. I didn't come here to change your minds. I came as a customer, not as a celebrity, just a man looking for a meal. A tense pause followed. Then, from the bar, the elderly man in the blue jacket murmured, It's a shame a man can't even eat a burger around here. The air in the restaurant broke just slightly. Some people half smiled, and even Don let out a small laugh, shaking his head. Reeves turned back to him. So now what? Don exhaled heavily, running a hand over his face. He glanced toward the kitchen where the cooks were still watching, then back to Reeves. I'll tell you something, Don finally said. If you stay here, finish this conversation, and by the end, I don't think you're just another guy talking nicely, then maybe, just maybe, I'll ask the waitress to bring you a menu. Reeves smiled slightly, amusement glinting in his eyes. Sounds fair. For the first time that evening, the atmosphere wasn't divided or confrontational. It felt like a conversation. The rigidness in Don's shoulders had softened slightly. Even the young man in the back had stopped smirking, now sitting up straight instead of lounging back as though it were entertainment. Customers who had been silently observing appeared less sure of their judgments. Reeves leaned forward gently. All right, he said quietly. Let's finish this conversation. Don sighed heavily and finally dropped into the chair opposite Reeves. He seemed tired. Not the tiredness from a long shift, but the weariness built over years from the weight of expectations and feeling unheard. Rubbing his hands together, he said, I'll tell you the truth. I don't know if you're the man people think you are. I don't know if you genuinely care about folks like us, or if you're just good at talking. Reeves nodded slowly. That's fair. Don studied him silently before continuing. But I do know one thing. People here have long memories. They remember every promise made, every handshake, every time someone looked them in the eye and promised to help, only to leave and never return. Reeves gently knocked his knuckles on the table, thoughtful. I don't blame them for that. Don let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. That's the problem. No one ever does. A heavy silence settled. From the bar, the older man in the blue jacket broke the moment. I worked 35 years in a factory, he said, setting his coffee cup down firmly. 35 damn years. I saw neighbors lose their jobs, entire families pack up and leave because there was nothing left here for them. Actors would come, shake our hands, tell us they understood. They will reflect our sadness, and then they'd get in their cars and go right back where they came from. Reeves met his gaze steadily. And you think I'm one of those lying actors? The older man watched him a long moment, then shrugged. I don't know. He paused, lifting a calloused finger to point at Reeves. But I'll tell you something. You're the only one who stayed to listen. His words fell heavily in the cafe. The waitress behind the counter shifted uneasily. The cooks glanced at each other. Even the young man at the back, previously critical, had nothing to say. Reeves allowed the silence to linger, then looked back at Don. "So, what are we going to do?" Don tapped his fingers on the table, glanced toward the kitchen and let out a long exhale. Finally, he stood up. "Mary," he called to the waitress, "bring him a menu." A ripple of surprise spread through the cafe. The young man snorted derisively but didn't argue. Mary hesitated briefly before taking a laminated menu and bringing it to the table. Reeves took it, nodding slightly. "Thank you." Don regarded him, half amused, half incredulous. "I still don't know if I like you." Reeves smiled, opening the menu. "That's fine. I don't need everyone to like me." Don chuckled briefly, turning toward the kitchen. "All right, guys, fire up the grill." What began as rejection turned into something no one in that cafe would forget. The tension hadn't fully vanished, but it dissipated enough for forks to clink against plates and conversations to resume softly. Reeves sat back comfortably, holding the menu without reading it, observing Don, the older man at the bar, and even the skeptical young man who had stopped smirking. Mary approached with a cup of coffee without a word. Reeves took a sip, arching an eyebrow. "Strong." Mary smiled faintly. "We always make it strong here." From the kitchen, Don watched, still uncertain of what to think. Eventually, he shook his head and returned to the grill. What had started as a confrontation ended differently. In a cafe in an ordinary town, on an ordinary night, a group of people chose to listen instead of fight, and sometimes that was enough. Thank you for watching. If the story warms your heart, subscribe to the channel and click the screen for more inspirational stories of resilience, compassion, and hope.